Welcome back, everyone, for day 2 of the March CAG meeting. And we have an ambitious agenda today. We're going to cover audit evidence. We're going to talk about group audits. We'll get a report back, ESG and fraud. So we have a lot to cover. We will end with a closed session. And I look forward to the discussion. Before we kick off the audit evidence, what I'd like to do is go to Dave, who talked to us in the private session with some of your reflections on day 1. But Dave, if you could just share your reflections again for us relative to day one, that would be helpful.
Great, I'd be happy to, Jim, and hopefully you can hear me.
Yes.
Great. Well, first of all, let me just say it's a pleasure to be meeting with you all today on day 2 of this meeting. I'll give you a couple of thoughts with respect to the meeting yesterday and give you some thoughts on today's meeting toward the end of the meeting today as well. But for those of you I haven't met yet, I'm Dave Sullivan. I recently joined the Public Interest Oversight Board. And last year, I retired after mostly a career in public accounting, working for Deloitte, where I was the U.S. and then global audit quality leader. So I have a passionate interest in the issues that you are discussing and that the IAASB is addressing, and so it's my pleasure to be here with you all. While Josephine isn't here, I want to thank her for her presentations yesterday. I thought they were very meaningful and well done, and then the input that you all had for her on the topics I thought was very useful and ought to be useful for the board as they go through their deliberations. Specifically with respect to the 2 projects that were discussed yesterday, I'll make a couple of general comments and then a couple of specific comments. In general, we're very supportive of these projects, and with what we see as the direction of these projects, we think they're important for the public interest. With respect to the public interest entity project, certainly want to commend the board for its collaboration with IAASB on this project. And as was discussed yesterday on the transparency issue, we think the transparency of this is very important. And while it may seem obvious this ought to be in the auditor's report so that it's readily accessible, we think that gathering information as the board plans to do is an important thing to do, and that getting feedback from users and investors with respect to the transparency issue will be important, as well as hearing from the profession. With respect to going concern, this is obviously a very, very important issue and was made more important a couple of years ago when the pandemic hit, and certainly now with the Ukraine situation and that sort of thing. And again, very supportive of the project, very supportive of the direction of the project, that it has the objectives of strengthening the auditor's assessment of management's evaluation of going concern, and then we'll address the transparency issue, transparency with users with respect to going concern. So I see that as a very positive. One thing I'd note is in looking through the materials, there at least currently is a planned shortened, while acceptable, shortened comment period, and I wouldn't want that to impair the ability to get feedback, especially from non-traditional individuals who would provide feedback. But it's very important to get the feedback again of users and investors, since this evaluation and doing this evaluation effectively is really important. And then, as mentioned with yesterday, certainly I encourage the collaboration with the IAASB on this project, but would hope that any project with respect to the IAASB would not slow down the work of the IAASB in this important project. And Jim, that's what I have, so I'll give it back to you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And with that, I think we'll move straight into our first topic, which is audit evidence. Sue Amin, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jim, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I know it's probably strange times for lots of you. So what I'm going to do is just work through the slides, which I think you've had in advance in any event, just to provide an update on where we are with the audit evidence project, highlight some of the things that we're going to be discussing with the board in the March meeting. We have quite a large chunk of time on the agenda for the March meeting, and this will be the first read through of the draft standard in full. So a lot of what we're going to be doing is reflecting on areas where we have agreed in principle with the board on the approach, but it's the first time they've probably seen the words written down. So it's really testing out whether the words are saying what they think they want to see. Next slide, please, Michelle. So what we have here is the timeline for the project. This hasn't changed since the discussion that we had back in September. So this is still working towards approval of an exposure draft in September this year, and then ultimate targeting approval of the standard in early 2024. I'm sure, as you will hear from anyone presenting, I guess these are targets and obviously dependent on board time and so on and so forth. But we've been doing an amazing job. I think actually the task force has worked really hard in the virtual environment. We haven't actually physically met yet, so we've managed to keep on the timeline there. Can I take the next slide, please, Michelle? So just perhaps a quick reminder to start off with around the purpose of the project and particularly the public interest issues, because I know they're of particular interest. These are exactly as we've talked about in previous discussions, responding to the key public interest areas of relevance and reliability of information intended to be used as audit evidence, reinforcing professional skepticism, re-looking at the purpose and scope of ISA 500 and the requirements that therefore need to be built in there, and detection risk. And I'll pick up some of these as we go through the later slides. We've put on the slide there the coordination element. There has been a lot of coordination with other groups within the IAASB. I know that was something that we were encouraged to do last time. I would reference in particular the technology consultation group. We are drawing on several pieces of their work that has been produced, particularly in relation to things like automation bias. And there's actually a draft piece on testing outliers using automated tools and techniques, and we have used some of that work in the draft that you see. And I'm absolutely sure that that will continue as we progress the project. In relation to professional skepticism and fraud, obviously those are established groups, and we have been working with them. Professional skepticism, particularly in relation to the critical assessment of audit evidence, and fraud when we were looking particularly at relevance and reliability of audit evidence. So there's been a fair amount of interaction with the groups that you have there. And then the final bullet on that slide references the CUSP, the complexity, understandability, scalability and proportionality guidelines. And I want to bring that to your attention because this is probably the first draft standard that anybody will see that's been prepared using those guidelines. And I suspect that there will be a few changes that I'll highlight as we go through, but also that it will be the first time the board sees those guidelines in action. So there are some changes, for example, in the definition sections that are not changes as a result of the thought process, but they're changes as a result of applying those guidelines. So just to be conscious of that, maybe. Next slide, please. Fantastic, thank you. Okay, so these were the three public interest issues that we've been working to, changes in information that's available, dealing with the evolution in technology, fostering professional skepticism. I think, well, hopefully you've picked this up as you've been looking at the slides, but we've used a kind of star marker on the material as we go forward. And the purpose of that really is to highlight that there are a lot of areas that we've talked about the principles with the board, but these are the first time where the board is actually seeing the detailed drafting. So you're obviously seeing the detailed drafting for the first time at the same time as the board is doing that. So you'll see that as we go through. Next slide, please, Michelle. So I'm going to, same as we did last time, walk through the objectives and where we've got to on some of the key issues and the key discussions. First area is around the purpose and the scope of ISA 500. I talked previously about the meaning of audit evidence and the fact that we've had, I think, good support from the board around the use of what we've termed the input-output model. So the fact that information that is intended to be used as audit evidence has to be subject to some form of audit procedure to become audit evidence. So audit evidence is the output. The board also reaffirmed that any procedure that's performed in accordance with any requirement in the ISA is an audit procedure for the purpose of obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence. And what that means is when we're talking about audit evidence, we're not just talking about further audit procedures, for example. It includes risk assessment procedures and other types of audit procedures that are done, perhaps as we're coming towards the reporting stage or the discussions with those charged with governance and so on. So all the activity, the output of that is audit evidence. And that's an important clarification because that fine-tunes what ISA 500 applies to. The final point here is about the relationship of ISA 500 with other ISAs, and this was something that we talked about with the board in July. And the board was supportive of the notion that ISA 500 is a reference framework for the audit in making judgments in relation to audit evidence. So it, as I said, it applies to all the audit evidence obtained throughout the audit, and that it's a conceptual standard that runs in parallel with the other ISAs. So it has the overarching requirements for the auditor throughout the audit. And it focuses more on the output. So it's about the evaluation of information to be used and the design and performance in order to achieve appropriate audit evidence. So ISA 500 is about setting the overarching requirements around the design and performance of audit procedures, but the responsibility to design and perform those procedures is addressed by the detailed requirements in the other ISAs. Next slide, please. So excellent, thank you. So I'm just checking I'm in the right place. Yeah, so the board was broadly supportive of the notion that ISA 500 is a reference framework. currently, when we looked at ISO 500, it has requirements dealing with the information to be used as audit evidence and the processing of that information, so the designing and performing of audit evidence. Phil, can you just, I think I'm one ahead.
Yeah,
sorry.
Yeah,
Michelle,
sorry,
Michelle,
slide.
can you go back one?
Yeah.
Sorry, people. Okay. So this is the final part of this slide down here. So where we're talking about the evaluation of audit evidence. So currently ISO 500's got requirements relating to the input and the processing. And the discussion we've had is whether there needs to be more in there to do with the output. So to address the conclusion on sufficient appropriate audit evidence. And what we're proposing is a requirement to essentially for the auditor to take a stand back position to look at whether the audit evidence obtained met the auditor's purposes. So it's taking that sort of objective look back to see whether we achieved what we thought we were going to. And that stand back then provides the basis for the auditor's conclusion under ISO 330 as to whether sufficient appropriate audit evidence has been obtained in relation to the audit as a whole. So that's a new paragraph 13 that you'll see that's being proposed in relation to that stand back. And then on the objective, we've had sessions with the board previously around the objective. We've now taken a look at that and reworked that to be more in line with the output-based approach. So looking more at whether the procedures are providing the basis for the conclusion, rather than whether looking at the design and performance of procedures. So you'll see that in paragraph 6 of the draft standard. So that's kind of aligning the standard. So we'll go on to the next slide now. Thanks. So the second objective for the project was around recognising that there's been an evolution in information sources that are available for auditors, and the consideration of relevance and reliability of the information, because obviously that affects the sufficiency and appropriateness of audit evidence. When I spoke to you in September, we talked about working on a principles-based requirement that applies to information that's intended to be used as audit evidence, that applies to all sources of information and all information irrespective of what format it may be. So whether it's digital or manual or what source it may come from. And we've worked on clarifying the work effort in evaluating the information to be used as audit evidence. And I'll probably just draw your attention to the use of the verb evaluate, because that is one of the changes that is in line with the draft custom guidelines. I think, having said that, it's also worth highlighting that the term evaluate doesn't necessarily mean the same work effort for every piece of information, irrespective of the source or the purpose. I know that it's something the CAG were highlighted last time I spoke around scalability and so on. So, clearly, if we're talking about information that's perhaps being used for risk assessment, then the degree of reliability may be different from something that is being used as a further audit procedure in a particular risk area. So there's a fair amount of application material that we've worked on there to describe how things like the source of the information might affect the work effort. So to try and bring some life and flavour and illustration to those different situations. And then lastly on this slide, we when I spoke to you in September, we highlighted the requirements in Extant 500 that specifically call out the attributes of completeness and accuracy when we're looking at relevance and reliability. The board expressed the view that it was important and in the public interest to retain that reference to completeness and accuracy, notwithstanding the work that we've also done to try and highlight that sometimes other factors will be potentially more important. So we have reworked the requirement there to incorporate the attributes of accuracy and completeness in the requirement, but with the qualifier that is already there that talks about as necessary. So perhaps raising the consideration of when other factors may be very important as well, but retaining that focus on completeness and accuracy as well. Next slide, please. So as I think I described previously, we've put a lot of work into the application material on relevance and reliability, describing the attributes of relevance and reliability, providing guidance on the availability and accessibility of information, aligning that with some of the application material that's in ISA 200, which was a feedback that we got from the board in March. ISA 200 has material in it that talks about the balance between benefit and cost. So that there may be situations where the costs outweigh the benefit, but equally that shouldn't stop auditors from obtaining audit evidence if it's the only or the best audit evidence available. So what we have in the application material is trying to walk the balance there between clearly, sort of scalability concerns and practicality concerns, but also the key public interest areas of quality of work and quality of evidence. And then finally on this slide, we have application materials on the different factors that affect the professional judgment when we're looking at the different attributes of relevance and reliability. Considering things like the source, what the information is going to be used for, the form of information, how it was obtained. But I think being very conscious also of the feedback that we had from the CAG previously and the board, that these attributes don't necessarily apply in every situation and they shouldn't be used as a checklist. So again, trying to add some flavour to the different situations and highlight what the factors may be that are most appropriate in different situations, and therefore illustrating that we don't expect a checklist approach. Next slide, please. The other piece that falls under this particular objective is around the concept of sufficient appropriate audit evidence and the definitions of sufficiency and appropriateness. I think when we've spoken to you previously, we've had a look at different iterations of the definitions. The feedback from the board when we looked at the definitions was the preference to retain as much of the current definitions as possible, largely because the board didn't feel that changing some of these definitions were necessarily going to drive changes in auditor behaviour. So we have substantially retained the terminology, but as I highlighted earlier, this is one of those areas where you will see changes, primarily because we're adjusting to comply with the CUSP guidelines. And probably the thing to draw out here is that the CUSP guidelines talk about not having descriptions within definitions. So the parts of the definitions that are descriptions have been moved to application material. So I think those are the main, probably the main changes on the definition front. In terms of relevance and reliability, we've talked about that by the quality of audit evidence really being affected by the relevance and reliability of the information that's intended to be used as audit evidence, and the effectiveness of the procedures that have been used. So that's the factors that we have at the bottom of this slide that really builds up the picture of sufficient, appropriate, and appropriateness of audit evidence. In line with the board guidance, we have not defined persuasiveness of audit evidence. What we've done is build application material to really explain and describe how it's used, rather than adding more layers onto the definitions of sufficiency and appropriateness. Next slide, please. Paragraph 10 talks about the specific requirements when the auditors used information that's been prepared by a management expert. So that's the material that's currently in paragraph 8. This is an area where we haven't yet discussed in detail with the board, but we are looking at paragraph 10 being a paragraph that builds on the overarching principles that are set out in the requirements in paragraph 9. So paragraph 10 addresses the specific implications when using information prepared by a management expert, but recognizing that the fundamental concepts of relevance and reliability are still apply, or have applied, that are set out in paragraph 9. So we're looking to get the board's feedback on that, whether we've articulated it appropriately. We want to make it clear that paragraph 9 applies to everything, information from all sources, as an overarching requirements, but we have retained the specific requirements around evaluating the competence, capability, and objectivity of the management expert. We've also extended and clarified in paragraphs 10b and 10c about understanding the work of the management experts. And I think there we're particularly thinking of understanding the information that has been prepared by the management expert, how management has then considered the appropriateness of the information that's been prepared by that expert, and how that information may have been modified by management, which could affect the reliability of the information. So we've taken the same lens as we would have for any information, and looked at it in the case of information prepared by management's expert. So there's possibly a little bit more in terms of the requirements we feel, but again, it will be useful to get feedback there. We've also considered pieces around the potential for bias in the management experts' work, which I think is important. In the application material, so the second part of this slide, I've mentioned information a few times in the presentation, or information sources. One of the drivers of this project is around reflecting the different information sources. So there's application material that addresses the sources of information through describing the different sources, how the source of information may affect the auditor's considerations when looking at relevance and reliability of information to be used as audit evidence. The Audit Evidence Task Force has proposed application material that gives examples of the possible information sources and the considerations of the various attributes. So I think we've probably already covered this, but it's designed to try and provide a range of situations to bring this to life and to highlight the different factors that may be relevant at different times, and also to highlight the potential for management bias at different times. So whether management's influence on the source may impact the propensity for it to be subject to management bias. The application material also notes that obtaining audit evidence in an unbiased manner may involve obtaining information from multiple sources or different sources, and I think that's something that has cropped up in our discussions previously around being alert for different sources of information. Next slide, please. The third project objective here is around modernising the standard to reflect the digital era and technology in particular. We discussed with the board previously the approach to developing a principles-based requirements that can be applied irrespective of whether technology is used or not. And so the requirements in the standards are not prescriptive in relation to the use of technology, but accommodate the use of technology. The application material builds on that principles-based approach and references that the auditor may use manual or automated tools or techniques individually or in combination with each other to perform audit procedures. But we have also noted that there may be circumstances where the use of automated techniques may be more effective. We've incorporated material to address the board's recommendation relating to automation bias, and we've done that in a way that I think addresses both the risks and the benefits of using automated techniques. So there may be circumstances where automated techniques may be more effective, but there may also be times when there is more exposure to automation bias. So there is material in there around mitigation of automation bias, and that material draws on the non-authoritative guidance that's been issued by the Technology Consultation Group. Next slide, please. When I spoke to you in September, we noted that we think it's important to provide examples in relation to demonstrating how the principles may apply when technology is involved. I'm conscious that there are some stakeholders who would like this to be a kind of how-to guide to using digital analysis tools. That's not going to be the case here, but we are working on examples of how the principles apply in different situations when the auditor is using automated tools and techniques. And we're drawing very much on the expertise and the guidance material that's been issued by the Technology Consultation Group. We have application material that distinguishes between automation bias that arises from the auditor using automated tools and techniques in performing audit procedures, and automation bias when the auditor is relying on information that has been generated by an automated system, for example, IT systems used by the client. And the considerations are different there, and we've provided examples of the particular considerations. Another example is application material that we've introduced in relation to the work effort in identifying outliers and exceptions when using automated tools and techniques. And again, that draws on the draft material that the Technology Consultation Group has. So we've learnt that it's quite difficult to develop concise examples in a way that is technology neutral. There are times when to be able to provide something that is meaningful, you need to have a certain amount of detail around the technology. So in the standard and the application material, the examples are quite neutral and are quite concise. The expectation is that the examples in the non-authoritative guidance can be a little bit more fulsome, and they are then more capable of being able to be updated as technology develops. We don't want to be in a position where the examples in the standard become outdated because of changes in technology. So the board has supported development of a separate publication on examples, and we will be working on that as to how that can be developed. And our expectation is that we will be providing some more information on that in the second quarter of this year. Next slide, please. So the final objective of the project was dealing with the exercise of professional skepticism in relation to audit evidence. Hopefully you've seen from what I've already said that there are quite a number of areas where we have, I think, enhanced some of the material in relation to the exercise of skepticism. We've considered the feedback that has come through the various consultation materials, and we've discussed with the professional skepticism group on some of the proposals. The requirements, the proposed new requirements or the enhanced requirements are set out on the slide, including things like designing and performing audit procedures in a manner that's not biased, enhanced material around when there are doubts about the relevance or reliability of information intended to be used as audit evidence, and if the audit evidence is inconsistent with other evidence, then needing to resolve that matter. And I think those last two bullets reflect some of the feedback that we had from the previous discussion with yourselves, because in the case where information to be used as audit evidence is not deemed to be relevant or reliable, then the material that we have is driving the auditor to obtain alternative or more information, and that may be information that comes from external sources. So it's driving that consideration more widely. So I think there are a number of areas where there's more enhancements in relation to skepticism. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier about a requirement to take a stand back and consider whether the audit evidence obtained meets the auditor's purposes as a basis for concluding whether sufficient audit evidence has been obtained. And I think that's one of the areas where we consider that reinforces the exercise of skepticism, because it is that stand back to consider the relevance and reliability of the evidence obtained before going into that final evaluation process. A specific area in the project proposal was reference to the critical assessment of audit evidence. We talked about that at the previous CAG meeting. We developed application material to address that, but primarily I think the view is that the requirements in 500, and particularly those reinforcing the exercise of skepticism, are the drivers for that critical assessment of audit evidence. So things like the stand back and so on. We've developed application material to explain these concepts without repeating what's in the other standards, and particularly without repeating what's in 220. But what we've tried to focus on is building application material that talks about how the biases that are described in 220 relate to audit evidence in particular. And in doing this, we've introduced guidance on detection risk. So building the link between audit evidence and quality management at the engagement level, providing again the link to 220. So I think that gives you a flavour of what we've done on the 4 key areas of the project. Next slide, please, Michelle. We have questions here for you really just to get your feedback on the principles-based standards that we will be working through. So recognizing the evolution in technology, but also keeping at a principles level, reinforcing the exercise of professional skepticism, addressing the public interest issues in the proposal, and obviously interested in any feedback you have and any suggestions. Really valued the input so far. So Jim, I think back to you. And I can already see a hand up.
Thanks, Sue. Yes, Barb?
Thank you. I thought that the draft looked very good. And with respect to the specific questions, I would most definitely support a principles-based standard. I think especially when you have something like this that is foundational in nature, the more principles-based it can be, the longer of a life it will have, and you won't find yourself having to open it up every few years as technology changes. We've spent quite a bit of time looking at our evidence standard, and I think it gives a lot of credit to the original I remember, but that so many of the principles remain relevant and really fit for use. And so very supportive of that. I also thought that you did a very good job trying to do what you can to promote skepticism. And in particular, I really liked paragraph 8. I do think that you may actually have come up with maybe enough material in the application material there for potentially even building out another requirement. When I look at the application material for 8A, it also seems to address watching out for bias more in evaluating audit evidence than in designing procedures. And so I'd maybe think about that. Maybe you could have that kind of tied back into the end, because I thought that you did a very good job of trying to capture and set forth requirements that a professionally skeptical person would have. So nice job. Thank you.
Thank you, Barb.
Thanks, Bob.
Heisen.
Yes, good evening. Thank you, Jim. And thank you for the presentation. It was really very clear about the audit evidence issues. And the most important is the coordination with the work that is going to be done by other groups, such as technology, fraud, and the others. And of course, we are very pleased to hear that the draft guidelines on complexity, understandability, scalability, and proportionality or CASP are considered and are applied in this stage with this project. And on this issue, we would like to ask if there is, any kind of a possibility or any replication that the other standalone standard on less complex entities could use such a way in the near future, because things are going to be very clear when this way is used. So we are very supportive on this, and I think that this could also address really the public interest, as you mentioned and clarified. Principle-based, even in case of technology, just create a good possibility to see this evidence, even in case of changing rapidly and frequently the technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Heisen. Akihito.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. I appreciate. I would like to mention some observations. In the revision of ISA 500, the change from current audit procedures mainly based on sampling to maybe mainly selecting all items by using technology in audit may need to be considered, I think. And it is need to revise the audit standards content that will not become outdated in light of future developments in technology. It is important, I think. And in my view, in performing technology-based audit procedures, the auditor may also need to consider the possibility of responding based on the technology of client. And also in performing technology based audit procedure, I think that also it is important to keep in mind not to require too much audit procedures and to balance the benefits of increased efficiency with the use of technology. Lastly, regarding A44, I think that external evidence obtained by auditor via the audit client also needs to be highlighted in a part of external evidence as well as obtained from related party in the respect of the increasing number of audit procedures being performed remotely. That's my observations. Thank you.
Thank you, Akihito. It does seem like we're getting a few nods to the principle-based nature of this standard. Klaus.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sue, for an excellent presentation. Just to be brief, I truly support the approach in the project that you have envisioned here, and it's very important to have a principles-based standard that recognizes the evolution in technology. I think it's absolutely proper to go in that direction. I also think it's very important that you reinforce the auditor's exercise of professional skepticism. That's, of course, a key feature also here in the development. And I also think that there's the way that you have approached those issues is that I think you clearly can answer the concerns about public interest issues that has been raised regarding the issues that comes into play in the ISA 500. So overall, I'm very supportive of the project. Thanks.
Thank you, Klaus. Paul Thompson.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Sue, for the presentation. Just one question. Heisen's already weighed in with some views from EFA for SMEs. My question has really more to do with the project, with how this sort of project was developed from the inception, because correct me if I'm wrong, this was the project where before you developed a project proposal, there was actually some degree of consultation, wide consultation, wider than what you would normally do. So if I am correct, I guess my question is for you, Sue, has this helped? Because this might be a model for future standard setting activities in terms of doing more initial research and outreach right at the outset, rather than sort of wait until the consultation phase using the exposure draft. Thank you.
Thank you. Sue, I have about 4 more hands. Do you want me to continue to receive the feedback, or would you like to respond?
I'm happy for you to carry on.
Very well.
Jim.
Christian.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sue, for presenting. I think this is very great. Also, we from Accountancy Europe overall support the approach you have been taken, and I think the revision of the standard was also crucial for the use of technology and AI. Pouring a bit of salt into the soup, we did notice that a lot of reference to technology appears to be moved into the application guidance. So we didn't find a lot reference made in the requirements. Just to give you an example, the automation bias is not defined, or the definition is not included in the requirements. And also it appears that the link to artificial intelligence is not really there. So the question is that something you will pick up on later? What we did realize is the professional skepticism, which at the end of the day is the heart of the matter, has been stressed. Nonetheless, based on what we've seen in the past, it appears to us that this can even be stressed more, especially as at the end of the day, performing audit procedures to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. The professional skepticism is key to obtain exactly that. And the last point to close, we deem it necessary to also pick up a link to the risk of fraud, as that is also something you are addressing in question 1C with respect to the public interest issues. So this is it from our side, but overall fully supportive of what you've done. So thank you very much for that.
Sue, I guess this is encouraging to have all this support as we go on here. Hussein.
Hi to everyone. Thank you very much for good presentation. I have some issues to raise. Firstly, adding paragraph to related with professional judgment and professional skepticism is useful. I think it's helpful to auditor when they're performing their audit work. But when we look at the new paragraph, there's an explicit statement on professional skepticism, emphasizing professional skepticism, but no emphasis on professional judgment. I think it's useful to put a statement which emphasize on professional judgment, because professional judgment is also important element for auditing. Secondly, for the relevance and reliability of information, these relevance and reliability terms are a subjective term. In order to be helpful for auditor, there should be here there should be some paragraph on relevance and reliability, some indicator or factor which draw the boundaries, which helpful to auditor. It's good for clear and consistent implementation of these issues. Another issue, the objective of ISA 500, as I see from the new draft, change extent. ISA 500 objective is to design and perform audit procedure. Here, there's a focus on emphasis on audit procedures, but new objective is to evaluate audit evidence, whether sufficient and appropriate. I think audit procedures are important element of audit standards, and here also there's a view, task force view, that describing and distinguishing between different type of audit procedures may no longer be appropriate focus in today's environment. Therefore, these audit procedures reallocate from application part to appendices. I do not agree with task force. I think audit procedures are important element, because audit evidence is the output of audit procedures. When we look at the audit methodology, audit procedures are the main pillar of methodology. We can observe that there are two separate standards: ISA 501 external confirmation, ISA 520 analytical procedure. Therefore, I think, in my opinion, it's better to collect all audit procedures in a separate standard, which very helpful to auditors, I think. Another issue is about information prepared by management expert as an audit evidence. I think it's useful to check whether it's here auditor responsibilities consistent with the ISA 620. This is similar. Like, okay, it's a work of auditor expert, but similar responsibilities can be here. Another issue is about audit evidence inconsistent with other audit evidence. Here, major focus, I understand, on audit evidence, but in the draft, there's a focus on audit evidence from audit performance. Auditor maybe obtain audit evidence from other sources. For example, with business relationship or during the quality management procedure. Therefore, it's useful to consider other sources can be evaluated as an audit evidence. Another issue is about persuasiveness of audit evidence. In draft, there are only, as I see, 3 factors: material risk of material misstatement, relevance, and reliability. I think it's useful to expand the factor affect the persuasiveness of audit evidence, which should be helpful to auditors. Lastly, form of information intended to be used as an audit evidence, also important issue. In this part, as a form of audit evidence, the digital form also mentioned, but I am not sure about the digital form covers all audit evidence, all information in electronic form. It should be reconsidered. Lastly, I think this standard related with the audit documentation standard ISA 230. Therefore, there should be some linkage, some connection between these two standards. We can observe audit evidence when we look at audit working paper. Working paper is the ISA 240 deal with the audit working paper. Therefore, all these issues I think is useful to consider during the development of this draft. Thank you.
Thank you, Heisen. And so you really are advocating for the procedures to be outside of this particular standard. So it's, in essence, you're more performant or more principle based.
Yes, yeah, I support it should be more principle based, but I think audit procedure also important element of auditing audit performance. Therefore, I suggest.
Thank you for clarifying. Kazuhiro, you are on.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Sue, for the presentation. I don't oppose the principle-based approach, but I have a brief question about how to deal with technology. For example, if the preparers of financial statements estimates the future cash flows using AI deep learning, and the process that led to the estimation results are not clear. In that case, are there any clues as to how the auditors collect audit evidence for the estimation in the revised standards and application material? Or conversely, are there any clue as to whether the auditors can utilize AI deep learning when collecting the audit evidence? Sorry for not principle-based question. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul Munter.
Thanks, Jim, and Sue, thanks for the presentation. Like many others also agree that a principles-based approach is the right approach for a lot of the reasons that others described, particularly as Barb kind of described at the outset, that if you can have a principles-based approach that is sufficiently robust, it's more likely to stand the test of time as technological advances occur. But kind of in light of the point that Kazuhiro was just making, the board might want to think about having some kind of an evergreen process vis-a-vis technology standing ready where there might be a need for educational material or something like that that can be developed, I'll call it more nimbly, to provide guidance to practice to complement the standard, might be something to think about on a go-forward basis as a means to be in a position to be responsive to technological advances over time. Thanks, Jim.
Oh, you're advocating for some supplemental material or guide or something like
Yeah,
that?
I don't think it's needed immediately. I think it's a standard to be developed, but I think over time they're going to be, I think there's no doubt there are going to be technological advances. And rather than having to embark on a standard setting project, if the standard itself is robust and principles based, they could, on an as needed basis, perhaps develop supplementary educational, admittedly non-authoritative materials in response to technological advances.
Okay, thank you. And Greg.
Thank you. I'll just speak quickly to point 2 or to question 2 because I haven't heard it said, although I think Heisen was sort of getting at this point as well. I just wonder if the task force considered moving the management expert content into its own standard, similar to the auditor's expert standard, which would, I think, address some of what Heisen was asking about in terms of comparability or consistency with that standard. But also, I did find that its placement in the evidence standard kind of clouded what was a very principles-based discussion to get into a very specific scenario. So I wondered if the task force had considered that. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Sue, I think that's all the hands I see at the moment.
Thank you. That's quite a suggestion collection, isn't it? When I said yes, I didn't realise how many more hands were going to go up. If it's okay with you, Jim, I'm going to start at the bottom probably and work my way upwards.
That's fine.
Greg, I probably had a similar response when I sort of looked at the updated 500 for all the things that had appeared from other conforming amendments, because the balance of the standards is there are times when it feels like it's swamped by things that have come from other places, and management experts, I think, is one of those. The task force did consider it. There isn't necessarily a natural home, and I'm not sure that there's appetite to sort of look at separate standards. But I think, you know, we'll see what the board thinks. As I highlighted, we haven't talked about this with the board, so I'll be interested to see whether we get a similar response there. Paul, your suggestion in relation to technology, and it probably picks up what several people said. Our approach in trying to keep this principles based was exactly to allow for the facility that you talked about being able to develop potentially more nimble guidance outside of the standard setting process. We've talked about the examples we're thinking about producing outside of the standard. The technology consultation group is providing material in this area as well. I think our expectation is that areas like that are better placed to provide guidance than within the standard. And I think, Kazuhiro, that possibly addresses what you had referenced there about AI and deep learning. I think if we're going to have a standard that stands the test of time, then some of those are best placed outside, although I do believe we've got an example in there relating to AI as well. Hussein, you raised a lot of points, and I think my best response is to say that we will work through some of these, and a number of the points that you raised are definitely issues that we have talked about in the task force at quite some length. Christian highlighted around the technology. Hopefully, I think the discussion we just had around technology picks up some of that. But you also referenced fraud, and I'm conscious that we have the fraud project that's ongoing, and clearly we need to work with the fraud group to try and make sure that between us we're picking up the relevant areas on fraud. Paul Thompson, you highlighted about the early consultation. I have to say that was before my time. So one of the reasons for not responding immediately was to get feedback from people who were around at that time. I understand that there was some outreach that was undertaken earlier. And I think, if I remember rightly, some of the way that the IAASB is talking about evolving some of the projects is around getting this information gathering piece to inform the consultation process before it moves on. Akihito, you talked about some of the technological moves and moving from sampling to all items. Things like the guidance that we have in relation to outliers, I think is starting to address that, but obviously will be complemented by examples outside of the standard. Heisen, you referenced the CUSP principles in the LCE paper. CUSP, I think, evolved as part of the LCE project. My understanding is that they are being adopted through the LCE project. I can see Billy's hands up, so maybe Billy, that might be a second one for you. And then I think Barb, you referenced about the application material for 8A and the evaluation. I think that's a really interesting point. And again, I think that let's see how the board responds. But I certainly take the point. So Jim, there's loads there for us to take away. I also, having responded to the detailed points, I think I also hear support for the principles-based approach, support for the kind of future-proofing and supplemental material on things like technology. So it's been incredibly helpful, and also I think I certainly feel like we have a good basis going into the board meeting. So appreciate that. But Billy, I think you're going to come in and no doubt correct me on something.
Billy, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And not correcting Sue on anything. I'll first deal with the CUSP comment that Sue referred to. Quite correct. One of the reasons why we really want to close off on the CUSP project, I think yesterday they referred to the fact that it will come to the April meeting, is that as the LCE task force is working through the comments that we received on the exposure draft, and would now obviously start to draft changes moving to a final standard, and that will be very helpful if that project is completed. So certainly it will apply in drafting the ISA for LCE as well. Actually, the reason why I originally put up my hand was just to give a little bit of, because Sue said, the information gathering and research was before her time, and Sue, you were quite right regarding that. And maybe just to remind everybody what happened is when we originally started this project at the end of 2018 and came into 2019, we were actually at the June 2019 board meeting proposing to the board that we move to a project proposal. And at that point, the board directed and said, no, let's do a little bit more specific outreach and consultation and get a little bit more information before we move into a project proposal. So that then led to us undertaking what Paul Thompson referred to as the additional targeted outreach and culminated in the project proposal that was approved in 2020. So although this project was outside our framework for activities, our framework for activities actually now accommodates that process. Because remember, in our framework for activities, we have component one as the information gathering and research to be much more deliberate and purposeful in terms of selecting what we're going to spend our time on and then scoping what we're going to do. So to a large extent, you would have seen that come through in the fraud project and the going concern projects. So I just wanted to provide that clarity. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Sue, I think you have you have 1 minute left.
Jim, I think Paul Thompson had his hand up again.
Oh, is there another hand? It's not showing on my screen.
But it was my thumb up to Willie's comment. Apologies.
Okay. There you go. An ancillary thumb up. Okay. Sue, anything else from your side?
No, just thanks. I was going to donate that minute to Lynn, but I think it's disappeared. But thank you all very much for the support and for the input, and of course we will take it back and work through in more detail.
Well, thank you for spending your time with us today. That was very helpful to go through this, and I think the feedback was good as well. So thanks again, Sue. Very well. Billy, you're not done, because I have you up next for group audits and the IAASB work plan.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. So this is agenda item F, and really the purpose of this agenda item is just to provide the CAG representatives with a report back on 2 of the projects that we've recently completed. So I think, Jim, what I'll do is I'll talk to both of them, and then obviously I'll just give an opportunity if the CAG representatives have any comments or observations. So firstly, if we look at agenda item F1, it is the project on ISA 600 revised, which is our standard on special considerations for audits of group financial statements, including the work of component auditors. So in December 2021, the IAASB unanimously approved the finalization of this standard, and also 18 out of 18 board members voted that there was no need to re-expose how we progressed the standard from the ED to the final. We also made sure that the final text of the standard was available on our website within the week after the board meeting, and that's obviously subject to approval of the PIOB's due process. ISA 600 revised will be effective for audits of group financial statements for periods beginning on or after December 15, 2023. And what will happen now is that the final standard with the basis for conclusions, together with the relevant due process documents, will be submitted to the PIOB for consideration at their meeting on April 4. And then when we get approval of the due process from the PIOB, the final standard and the basis for conclusions will be published together. So the CAG had an opportunity in September 2021 to provide input. Since then, the ISA 600 task force obviously progressed the standard further based on the input that was received from the CAG representatives, as well as the board meeting from September. And obviously during the December meeting, there was also further comments from the board, and that culminated finally in the approval session that we had. So in agenda item F1, in paragraph 5 on pages 1 to 5, we provided the CAG with a report back on how we responded to representatives' comments from the September meeting. I'm not going to go through all of that. I will take that as read. In a similar vein, if we look at agenda item F2, that deals with the IAASB work plan for 2022 to 2023. This was also considered by the board in December 2021. And again, 18 out of 18 board members approved the work plan. Obviously, the work plan has no effective date. It is effective immediately, subject to the PIOB approval. And again, the PIOB will consider the work plan together with the relevant due process documents at their meeting on April 4. The final text of the work plan was also was also available on the IAASB website in the week after the board meeting in December. So the CAG provided us with very important input during the September 2021 meeting. And I think from the input from the CAG in September 2021, the board's deliberations in September as well as December, as well as additional outreach that we continue to do in Q4 of 2021, there were some significant changes that were made to the work plan that was finally approved. So I just want to highlight to the CAG that, remember, this work plan covers the 2-year period that fills the gap to complete our strategy period 2020 to 2023. So it deals with the last 2 years and really is divided into 2 big sections. It is the work plan in the first instance reports that we've received support that we should continue to finalize and complete the projects that were already underway at the start of 2022. And then obviously we had to address what possible new projects we will take on. And we did indicate in the work plan that we, as projects start to close down and capacity starts to open up, we probably have capacity to start with 1 or 2 new projects within this work plan period of 2022 to 2023. One of those spots have now been taken because in the work plan we have now committed to a dedicated work stream on assurance of sustainability or ESG reporting, assurance on sustainability or ESG reporting. The work plan then elaborates on what the other possible candidate topics could be for any further project. And that was based on input that we've received from the stakeholders. And we also have explained how we will select the next topic that's in addition to sustainability or ESG reporting in accordance with our framework for activities. So again, in agenda item F2 in paragraph 5, we've set out in table format how the IAASB responded to representatives' comments. So Jim, that's the report back on F1 and F2, the 2 projects that we've recently completed, ISO 600 in the work plan. I'm happy to take any comments or observations from CAG representatives.
Thank you. Let me see if we have any hands up here. I'm not showing any. Phil, are you seeing anything differently than my screen?
There's no hands now.
Okay. Well, thank you, Billy.
Thank you, Jim.
I think what we have next is 4:16. We're going to go into a break. We will reconvene at why don't we reconvene at 4:30, so on the half hour here, and we'll hear about some ESG from Len Provost. All right, thank you, everyone. See everyone shortly. welcome back. Lynn, it's nice to see you.
And to see you all.
Give me 1 second here. All right, Lynn, I'll let you kick it off. Oops. This is reporting pause. So are we ready to go, Michelle?
Yes, you could. The presentation is up.
Okay, I just saw a reporting paused on my side here.
No. Okay, we're good.
Okay. With that, ESG, we've talked a little bit about ESG in previous CAG meetings, Lynn, so we look forward to your update.
Thank you very much, Jim, and good morning, good evening, or good afternoon to all of you. This is an area that the IAASB is starting to put some additional focus on. So what I intend to do today is run you through at a high level where our thinking and where our issues are, and I'm hoping that at the end there will be time for some of your input and discussion. Next slide, please, Michelle. There's a lot happening in the sustainability area. The demand from investors, regulators, NGOs, the UN for this kind of information is growing, and there is a subtle shift from voluntary reporting to mandatory reporting. As examples, in November 2021, the IFRS Foundation trustees announced the creation of the International Sustainability Standards Board to help meet that demand. And in the EU, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive proposes mandatory assurance on sustainability information. So with that growing demand, and that reporting changing, the IFAC and AICPA did a study to look at how much assurance is actually being provided at present. And currently 51% of companies that have this kind of information have some level of assurance. And of those, 63% of the assurance is done by auditors. Most of that assurance goes across a very wide spectrum, but it is often narrow in scope and includes, and it is limited assurance rather than reasonable assurance. So with all that activity, with all that demand, the IAASB decided that we should look at what are the big issues that affect us and what should we do about it. So we have started up, we have established a working group. The board has agreed that we will look at this area about where to next and what should we be doing to address this demand. Next slide, please, Michelle. And we've broadly started to think about this work. And so what are the topics people are reporting on? What information are they disclosing and what mechanisms are they using? And just to take a couple of examples, from topics, we have, and I'll take water as an example. we have people that are talking about water consumption, water discharge. They're then giving information that can be a mixture of the information in the middle column. You could talk about their strategy, their risks, what their metrics are, what the internal controls are, and can also do impact or scenario analysis. And then the reporting can be in a variety of different forms. Integrated reporting is one of them, sustainability reporting another, etc., as shown in the final column. So broadly, we are looking at that kind of frame to think about what we might do. Next slide, please. And in the paper, we use that frame, and we also talk about some specifics about where the current thinking of the sustainability advisory group is at this point in time. And just to pick out a couple of things from the paper that we talk about. The first one is we have debated whether we should be looking at reporting standard, a particular reporting standard, or whether we should maintain the neutrality that has been the case with ICES. Currently, our thinking is that the neutrality is important, but we're certainly open to discussion in that area. We've also looked at potentially who are the users of this information. Should we just be looking at investors, or should we be looking at the broad range of stakeholders? And our thinking is the broad range of stakeholders at present. So those are just a couple of the ideas that are in the paper. There are, of course, many more, and our opinions are in there. Moving right on to the next slide, please. We've been involved in this area for some time, starting in 2014, through the Integrated Reporting Work Group. And in the last year, we had, and as a result of that, we've got the umbrella standard ISAE 3000 and the greenhouse gases standard ISAE 3410. And last year we addressed the issues on the right-hand side in the EER guidance. And we are now asking across stakeholders, investors and assurers and every other interested party, what are the current challenges and what should we do about them? So that's where we're at. We are hearing that people see 3000 as the umbrella standard and that that's important. We see people asking questions like the EER guidance is useful, but it's not authoritative. Next slide, please. So we are asking questions such as shown in this diagram. For 3000, we're asking, are there any possible actions that are needed? Are there, for each challenge, is it addressed in 3000? If yes, are there any possible actions? It could be guidance. If no, is it addressed in the EER guidance and flow through from that? Till we get to, should we actually address a subject matter specific ISAE, think 3410 as an example, should we do targeted changes to ISA 3000? Or should we expand guidance or develop some new guidance? And of course, there's always an option of do nothing, but that isn't our preference at this point. That isn't high on our preferences at this point in time. Next slide, please. One of the key challenges that we are very aware of is that there is an integration of non-financial and financial information. And in some places, that is in the financial statements. And that raises the issue of how do we deal with the nexus between financial and non-financial information, between the ISAs and the ISAEs. So that's a potential issue that has been raised in addition to the ones that I've already talked about and those in the paper. And another consideration we're thinking about is we have got, we put out a discussion paper before we did the EER guidance, and we are not thinking of doing that this time, but we are thinking of some very targeted stakeholder input about what would be most useful to those stakeholders. And so we're asking the board as one of our questions, who are those stakeholders that we should be talking to? Next slide, please, Michelle. Just to give you some sense of where we are at this point in time, we established the Sustainability Assurance Consultative Group in December after the board decided that we would do some substantive work in this area. And at the March meeting in 2 weeks' time, we are going to have a session to discuss the paper. It will start with presentations from people who are active in this area, preparers, assurers, standard setters, etc. And then we will move into discussion groups where people will be put the questions in the issues paper. Our next time of coming back to the board coincides with the CAG meeting, I think. So we will have by then an advanced proposal on what we think should be doing, and somewhere between now and December, a possible project proposal. Obviously, they can change over time, but that is our best estimate of what would happen, what should happen at present. Last slide, please, Michelle. I've deliberately gone very quickly through this because you've all had the paper and it sets out the issues reasonably well. And I did want to have some time for some initial reactions from people. We haven't been specific in terms of our questions or comments, but maybe if you think about 3 questions. What are the main issues in this area? What mechanisms do you think we should use to address them? And thirdly, which stakeholders do you think we should be talking to? So, Jim, with that, can I turn back to you and take any discussion or questions on either anything I've said or those 3 questions? Thank you, Jim.
It's a lot to consider. It almost seems like the overwhelming question is whether 3,000 is fit for purpose, and go from there. But we do have some questions. Paul?
Thank you, Jim. Yeah, it's, well, let me first of all say that I'm really happy to see this on the agenda. I'm really happy to hear that a working group has already been formed, and happy to see that the work plan of the IAASB going forward is that it explicitly includes this subject, not least because I've been banging on about it in previous meetings, because of the urgency around it, because things are just moving so incredibly quickly. We've practically overnight gone from leaving it to market forces to one of regulation, certainly speaking from the perspective in the European Union. I note that the news has already sort of picked up and recognised that the IAASB has been responsive. I think Reuters ran quite a significant piece on sustainability assurance quite recently. In terms of the specifics, I mean, let me start that IFA, we did make some similar comments in relation to the same agenda item on the IAASB CAG, in brief, saying, look, sustainability reporting assurance is going to assume equal prominence and importance to financial reporting and financial statement audit in the coming few years, certainly in the European Union, and I suspect other regions likely will follow. But, professional accountants typically are not educated and trained in ESG and sustainability subject matter. So they're going to be reliant upon experts who they're going to have to manage. So, there's a lot of obviously implications there. Professional accountants working alongside subject matter experts, hopefully leading multidisciplinary teams in that area. In the European Union, there's also efforts underway to open up the sustainability assurance market to independent assurance providers other than auditors. Already ISAE 3000 appears to be, not only in the European Union, but in other regions, is being used by non-professional accountants, non-auditors. The SMPs that IFA speaks up on behalf of, these guys are going to really need to build capacity to be able to offer high quality sustainability assurance services. And they're going to have to do that very quickly. My inclination, Lynn, is, I've looked at your decision tree. I love the decision tree. But I'm kind of inevitably drawn through that decision tree to where the European Union wants to land, which is a subject matter specific ISAE 3000, either being produced by the IAASB. If not them, then I wonder whether they're going to be looking elsewhere or looking to themselves to develop something. So that's kind of where I think we're going to end up. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. Hilda.
Thank you, Jim, and good afternoon and good morning, good evening, good night to all of you. Thank you, Lynn, for your presentation. And Accounts Europe is also from Europe, so we are also very supportive of this project because we need this, because we will first have mandatory limited assurance for a period, 3 years, 5 years, we don't know yet. And then we will have reasonable assurance to be provided on sustainability assurance. So you refer to fragmentation or trying to avoid it in your presentation. That is actually key, because that's why we really would appreciate that there is the European, not only a European initiative, but an international initiative, so that we can rely on that. You asked for stakeholders. You directly liaising with the European Commission and the European Committee on Audit Oversight Bodies, that is having an arm looking into standards. That we would find very, very useful, because they could formulate to you what it is that they would look for. They will not look at standards for limited assurance, but they want to adopt a reasonable assurance standard. And so that's why this is quite important for us. They will not tell you how to do it. They are not into this, but at least they would have expectations that we would hope would help the work that you would be doing. As far as the main issues for the limited assurance period, practitioners tell us that ISAE 3000 plus the EER guidance can get you more or less there, but that there will be tweaks needed, and that it would still be good. There is some kind of an integration, that you have something which looks like a standard and not things that you have to amalgamate. As far as the real issues, we hear one which is about the preconditions in order to do such an engagement. And especially, what about, and it links to what Paul said, there is going to be a need for time, not only for practitioners, but also for companies to build up their sustainability assurance. And the preconditions to have assurance on it might not always be met. So what does that mean for an assurance provider in an area like Europe, where we will have mandatory assurance, so you can't just escape from it? So what would that be? How can we work through that? What does that mean for the reporting that we would need to do if the preconditions are not met? That's quite an important matter that preoccupies us. And then as far as the more detailed areas that we hear, further guidance would be needed on, in addition to ISAE 3000. It's matters around, understanding the entity and its environment. It's about the assurance on the materiality process. It's on the type of procedures to be conducted. It's on the multidisciplinary expertise required, on the consideration of completeness of information, and then on how to assure narrative information, how to assure forward-looking information. That's what we hear coming back time and time again. Within Accounts Europe, we are working on quite a substantial piece that we hope to issue in April, which is around, in practice, how can assurance providers prepare for providing this assurance, and then a roadmap towards this reasonable assurance, but that's not standard setting. This is trying to be practical. So we would be very happy to discuss that with you once we have the outcome, as we would hope that it would be useful to you. We could make a lot more comments and go in a lot more detail, because this is one of our main priorities, but in the interest of time, I will keep it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hilda. Akihito.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Lynn, for your clear presentation. Let me share some comments briefly. First, the framework for assurance on sustainability and ESG reporting is not yet defined in each jurisdiction as of now, and the global assurance standard should be developed considering a balance between timeliness and appropriateness, I think. And regarding Sustainability Assurance Consultation Group, SACG, I believe that ensuring sufficient resources and diversity is crucial. And it may be necessary to envision cases where assurance on sustainability and ESG reporting is performed by non-professional accountants. I think that it is also needs to keep in mind that non-professional accountants use assurance standards. And regarding the intended users of assurance practitioners report, it may be a good idea, makes sense for IAASB to aim to set a global baseline, adopt a building block approach from the perspective of the consistency with IAASB, which is developing the disclosure standard. And regarding the scope, I think that the scope should not be too broad in the first step, but should focus first on climate-related issues. And additional topics need to be considered based on IAASB agenda consultation. I think that it is important to keep pace with IAASB. Lastly, in cases where the auditor of financial reporting and assurance provider of sustainability ESG information differ, prior coordination is crucial point to be considered, I think. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Akihito. And Lynn, I have about 4 more comments. Do you want me to continue?
Yes, please.
Okay, Klaus.
Thanks, Lynn, for an excellent presentation on a very important topic. Just to mirror what others have already said, this is one of the most important topics right now on the top of the list, and I totally concur with Paul and what Hilda said. And not repeating what Paul and Hilda said about the situation in the EU right now, where we have mandatory assurance coming out of the rules. So, but just to add something to that, to start with the answer to your question on slide 4, should the IASB focus on assurance more broadly? And I say, is there an alternative? I would say that you need to take a holistic view on this right now, given the developments here. Otherwise, you will be completely lost in a matter that's evolves so fast nowadays. Having said that, also to answer your question about who should you talk to, there's a broad range of stakeholders in this, not only investors, not only the capital market. You need to reach out broadly to users of information. There are different users. You also need to reach out to preparers to understand the reporting side of it, and also given that the reports on sustainability are very different in nature and scope, and the objectives are different, and what's happening in Europe is one thing, the IAASB developments targeting the capital market is another one, but you need to get a grasp on that. Adding to another challenge that will come probably out of what's happening in the European Union is also that when you think about which companies that report today compared which companies will report on sustainability or ESG factors tomorrow, you will also see the development will be that not only PIEs, but also other SME companies in the future will have to draw up more reports than today. This probably also will create a challenge also for setting standards for sustainability assurance. In that sense, we might have to think about, do you need to make it scalable? The starting point for reporting in an SMB is totally different compared to PIE, for example, and it's also very dependent on what reporting requirements will be for SMEs compared to, for example, PIEs. So just adding to what is another challenge there. The technical sense, what to do if you should amend ISA 3000 or what you should do, that's a matter for you as a profession to best assess, I would say. But this is to sum up, it's so important to get this right and get it going right now. Thanks.
Thank you, Klaus. Kazuhiro.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Lynn, for the presentation. I appreciate the IAASB. In Japan, the interest of investors and companies in sustainability information is rapidly increasing. Not only ESG analysts, but also financial information analysts are beginning to consider how ESG information can be used in corporate analysis. The current situation is like a flood of sustainability information and users are beginning to require the quality of those information. Therefore, I'd like to thank the IAASB from the user's point of view for starting to consider the development of standards and guidance regarding the assurance of sustainability information. Users don't want the fragmentation of the institution that sets the assurance standards. So I support SACG's stance, which is neutral to reporting mechanism with a broad view of sustainability information topics and intended users from the perspective of preventive fragmentation. However, in that stance, I'm afraid that even if new standards and guidance are developed, those standards and guidance that are not so different from the current IASAE 3000 and EER guidance will be developed. I think that the users want the development standards and guidance with a view to responding to IAASB, IASSB, and EU FLAG, which are currently developing disclosure standards. In addition, some topics information on sustainability information are assured by specialized institutions other than audit firms. From the perspective of preventing fragmentation and securing resources for the development of standards and guidance, I think it might be an option to work with such institution. Finally, I'd like to suggest for outreach targets. I suggest adding the CFA Institute or FFAS, European Federation of Financial Analyst Societies, that have the ESG, that offer ESG analyst qualifications and ESG evaluation bodies. I think the former has knowledge about integration of financial and sustainability information, and the latter, ESG evaluation, utilize non-assured information. If a company is evaluated with non-assured information, the meaning of the project is reduced. To prevent such situation, I propose to conduct hearing with ESG evaluation institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Yoshihiro. Natasha, how are you?
Great, thank you. Very well. I guess I would echo all the comments saying this is brilliant, it's very much needed, from an investor perspective, absolutely, more and more investors are clearly relying on ESG information in making investment decisions, and ultimately, therefore, it needs to be accurate and verifiable. I will reiterate a comment I made yesterday, which is it's good to see you note the feedback loop to the financials under other considerations. I probably would, well, my question is then, what priority is being given to that? Because I would argue, and I think many investors, so just for background, over 100 trillion of AUM have signed a statement specifically asking for financial statements to be enhanced to incorporate climate risks, for example. So there's a very clear investor demand for that feedback loop to be very apparent and visible within the financial statements. So following on from the staff bulletin or can't remember the technical term, audit practice alert, I think it is, that was issued by the IAASB on this exact topic 2 years ago. What action is being taken to make sure that that's actually filtering into the system? Because it's very important, obviously, for assurance of the non-financial, but, there's already a job there, which is assurance of the financials. And no new standards are required for this, but there is certainly a requirement for the existing standards to be implemented to include this information where it's material. And there's been reports, and I'm sure you've seen, there was a big report called Flying Blind that was published not too long ago, looking at the audits as well as the accounts of 107 listed companies which have clear climate exposures. And, there were literally just a few handful where the auditor made the appropriate comment. So these are companies where you would expect the auditors to have covered the issue, and they did not. So notwithstanding the IAASB's alert, there's a implementation problem. So I go back to my question, which is, what priority is being given to IAASB, and what else could be done to make sure that that gap between guidance and practice is being closed? And I wouldn't limit that to climate, by the way. I think the more you expand to other ESG issues, there are certainly financial implications, whether it's because companies are making a commitment to clean water, or they're making a commitment to human rights, or they're making, all of those commitments would have potential financial implications in implementation and meeting targets, or in potential regulatory liabilities, litigation. There are all sorts of things that feed back to the financials. So that's one kind of sort of area. The second thing I would just say is, again, on this question of audience, I think it's right that there are many users, just so there are, frankly, financial statements beyond the shareholders. It's just, legally speaking, it's the shareholders, I believe, the members who are the recipients. And I think it's really important to establish who precisely the legal recipients of this assurance work will be, talking now about just the ESG assurance, because if you don't have that, then the governance becomes very opaque. You need to know who it's for, so those recipients, if in effect, can hold the people who are delivering it, whether it's the preparers or the auditors in this case, to account. And there has to be a whole framework around that, because otherwise it's a kind of very nebulous, we're just, assuring it for the public. but then who is the person holding, the auditor, and I say they're prepared to account for the delivery of reliable information. I would argue that this is, frankly, it would be quite an easy logic to say it's also for investors in the first instance, because in a way you're almost if the information is in the narrative part of an annual report and account, then you're extending the audit to the narrative part, which is something many have argued would make sense anyway. And then you have the consistency between the narrative and the financial that then will flow very logically. So I'll stop there, but lots of thoughts on that and questions too. Thank you.
Lots to think about. Dawn?
Thanks very much for your presentation, Lynn. The SMPAG is very supportive of this initiative. It's going to be an area that will be new for many SMPs and obviously challenging. But we do recognize, particularly as it moves from the voluntary into more of the mandatory realm, that it's going to be something that we're going to have to move into as a recognized practice area for our sector. And indeed, in my view, it's an area where the future generations of SMP are going to have to go there to survive. So I just wanted to thank you for acknowledging the SMP group as a stakeholder in the paper. We appreciate that.
Thank you, Dawn. And Henry.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you, Lynn, for the presentation. So just like others, just to echo that it's great to see the work going on in this area and the increasing focus that it's having. As you said, there's increasing demand for this information, and it's an area where the landscape has just been developing at such speed and pace over the last few months, really. So, as you mentioned, at the foundation, there's now a sister board to the IAASB, the International Sustainability Standards Board. The focus of the board is meeting the disclosure demand from investors, but setting a sort of global baseline of standards that can then also be extended to meet broader needs beyond investors. And I just wanted to highlight that really the IAASB is actually now becoming operational. Work is proceeding at pace, and the momentum is continuing. And so, in fact, the IAASB's first 2 exposure drafts are expected very soon. And I know we'll be welcoming feedback from the IAASB. These acronyms are really difficult in due course on these standards. We're also hearing very much at the foundation that assurance is a critical component, to the overall success of this reporting. We heard this recently at an IOSCO roundtable. So, we're looking forward to the extending, if you like, the collaboration that we've historically had with the on the IAASB side to the IAASB side. But I guess I just wanted to, just highlight the pace that things are moving at and emphasize the timeliness aspect to the work that, the important work you're doing in this area. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry. Tom?
So thank you for all these comments, because as I say to the board, and as Lynn heard me said too, is that we're trying to determine what are the most impactful items that we could do now in a brief period of time to help advance consistency, quality, and avoid fragmentation in the area of assurance. So all of this has been very helpful in helping to inform our board discussions next week. It's appropriate that I follow Henry, because and I want to give, while we're talking about your ideas for engagement, I wanted to give you a sense that we haven't been sitting on our hands in the meantime. We've been engaging a lot of people, particularly in the official world, to ensure that we have a cohesive and coordinated approach. So I've already spoken to the IAASB, and we hope that type of engagement, as we have on the audit side for accounting standards, will exist, and I'm certain that will be the case. We've also engaged with IOSCO, IFER, the Financial Stability Board, quite closely on, again, getting their opinions on what are the most impactful actions our board should have. For the Europeans, I heard Paul and Hilda loud and clear. You'll be pleased over the last few weeks, we've had actually quite intense discussions with the European Commission and the CEAOB too, asking them precisely that, and ensure that they understand that we're quite willing to act, which is, I think, what the whole premise of what we did in our work plan is, and what's in the papers that you saw and are coming to the board next week. So I want to give you a sense that we grasp how many players are involved in this, what the level of demand is about, what the urgency is to act. So we may be able to do things in batches, because we can't accomplish everything at once. Again, that's why I always say, what's the most impactful thing we could do? And then I add the time component. So it's likely to be a series of actions over time. And we're conscious of that. Remember, the audit standards weren't built in a day either, as well. So I wanted to give you a sense of the amount of engagement and how much priority we're doing this. And the working group has done an extraordinary job to try to make it easy for this board to understand what our options are going forward.
Thanks, Tom. Paul, you have your hand up?
Yes, again, thanks for the second bite of the cherry. Tom, music to my ears, what you've just said. That's great to hear. Just 2 points just to pick up on. I was so glad that Klaus mentioned about SMEs, the impact on SMEs You know, within the European Union, CSRD likely will only scope in larger companies and those that are listed. But the reality is, through the value chain and through the requirements of banks, the SMEs ain't going to escape from this. Many SMEs are going to have to provide it, not only produce the reports, but also have them subject to assurance. So thanks, Klaus, for mentioning that. And then in terms of other stakeholders, for ideas, Lynn, maybe worth just checking out IFRAG's sustainability reporting pillar, the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group. Of course, it's more than financial now. Their membership has now been expanded to include a lot of civil society and others. And I've included in the chat the link to the various organizations within the European Union that are being scoped into the work on sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Lynn, well, you asked, so we certainly delivered a lot of feedback for you, and I'll let you respond as you see fit.
Yeah, I'd love to be able to respond to every comment, but I can't. So let me just pick some of them. The first thing that hit me was the overwhelming support. Everybody started with support for this work. So that's really useful to hear. Given that about 40% of this work is done by other practitioners, it's certainly an area that we are looking at how we involve them in the consultation and the process going forward, because we know they use 3,000. So it's a good point and an important one going forward. A subject matter standard is certainly on the agenda. Potentially, I just don't want to close things at this point in time in terms of the mechanisms we might use, because every interaction we have gives us a rich source of information and issues. And until we make sure we know what are the big issues at this point in time, we're trying to keep an open mind on the mechanisms. Limited and a reasonable assurance and which one we go for is a definite issue. We're hearing from a lot of people that they want to hear about the types of procedures and what procedures you should use. The building block approach is certainly one that we've talked about in the paper and one that's in our heads. The SME, SMP area is certainly one that we need to think about very carefully. It sounded to me, reading between the lines and from some explicit comments, that continuing our standard neutral approach was supported, and that we look at the broad range of users. And I thank you for all that input in terms of the stakeholders. In terms of the financial, non-financial nexus, Natasha, that you brought up, that is certainly one of the key challenges, and it's one of the issues that we have on the table to think about. Is this the one we should be dealing with first? It does have to be dealt with, it's just when it's dealt with. And it's interesting to me that it's not only the big companies here, this is very common in the public sector. So certainly is top of mind for me as we talk about this. And just to finish on how quick the changes are here, when we put out the EER guidance a year ago, people were sort of so-so about whether they needed assurance. Now it's become a critical matter, and that shows just how quickly things are moving and why we need to, in a timely way, react to this. So, Jim, I'm really sorry we've gone a long way over what my allocated time was for this topic, but it was such valuable input. I really appreciate you giving us the opportunity to hear it all. And I want to assure CAG that this is not the last time we'll have this discussion. And if you have any input in the meantime, between now and September, of anything you hear, equally happy to hear it. So many, many thanks to you all for that really valuable discussion.
Thank you, Lynn. I think we somewhat expected it might run a little long here, given the topic. So, but that does leave you with fraud.
It does leave me with fraud.
No break.
And a shorter time, which I appreciate. So moving right on, now that we've done sustainability, to fraud, and where we're at in terms of fraud and audit of financial statements. In December 2021, the project proposal was discussed by the board. Lots of input was received, and it ended with an approval of that project proposal. So we now are well on our way. We have a plan and we have a agreed proposal. And the purpose of the paper to the board in March is to deal with 4 issues. The first one is alignment with 315. The second, communication with those charged with governance. The third is the non-authoritative guidance of the link between the fraud standard 240 and the rest of the ISAs. And the issue which has the most mixed positions of people, transparency and reporting on fraud. Next slide, please. So taking those one at a time, one of the biggest issues raised by the feedback was the identifying and assessing the ROMs due to fraud. And we have looked at this in two ways. Firstly, the structure and flow, and secondly, the content. So in terms of the structure and flow, we know that 315 is a foundational standard. It's new, and we have done in the paper a comparison of what the flow of 315 is and the flow of 240. And our proposal is that we align the two. We believe that that would be the most helpful for users to be able to follow both standards in the same way. So our proposal as a task force is that we do that restructure, and that we have 315 as the foundational standard and 240 adds the special considerations to do with fraud. So in the lingo we are using in the paper, we'll use 240 as our fraud lens. As well as that, we are talking about some changes in terms of strengthening the requirements, particular areas that we are looking at, the understanding the entity and the environment, the applicable financial reporting and internal controls. You might remember in December, we talked about tone at the top, culture, etc., as being important parts of that. So that's our proposals on 315. Next slide, please. The next thing we've done, looked at, is communication with those charged with governance. The first thing we've done in terms of this area is decouple it from reporting. We actually now are aligning it to the 315 issues and the internal issues in terms of an entity. So we have moved it to this position. We have also done two things in terms of those charged with governance. The first one is to make sure that it is a two-way conversation, and our proposal is that we elevate this to a requirement. The second proposal we have is to reinforce as we go through the changes that this is ongoing, this communication. You can't just tick at the beginning, we've done the risk assessment, we've talked to those charged with governance, finished. It is an ongoing discussion, and we are looking to put in place that theme throughout the standard. Next slide, please. Okay, the next area that we were asked to look at was some non-authoritative guidance, and this was to be done up front in Q1 of how 240 fits with the other standards, not every standard, but the more important or critical ones. So the framework we have used is the headings in 240 are in the blue circle. They largely align with the objectives of 240, namely in the top left-hand corner, the risk assessment, in the right-hand top corner, how you then assess your risks. So one is identification, one is assessing them. To the bottom corners where we have reporting and skepticism and evidence, and connecting out to the particular lens, fraud lens in the other standards. We have got some text around that to help explain it, and we're interested, like with all three topics to date, on feedback. Moving right on. Okay, this has been the most contentious area of the fraud discussion so far. It's also the one where there's the most development across the world happening. And so what we have done is put together 4 potential options in terms of the transparency and reporting on fraud. Alternative 1 is where we're looking at very detailed description of your fraud risks, what the auditor did and what the auditor concluded. So that's alternative 1. Alternative 2 is based on the Netherlands new standard, and it has a high-level description of the fraud risks identified and how the auditor addressed them. And in the appendix, in one of the papers, we have actually provided a number of examples from the UK and the Netherlands of these audit reports, so you can see what this actually means in practice. And alternative 3 is based on the UK version, and it is where you explain the extent to which the audit is considered capable of identifying risks due to fraud, and it's a part of the auditor's report. We then have an alternative 4, which is any other mechanism that could be used to provide greater transparency. So this could be CAMS, it could be the firm's transparency report, it could be information put on the website. There are a number of different options there. So I know I've gone through this incredibly quickly, but in the interest of time and listening to you and knowing you've read the paper, I thought that that was the best thing to do. So moving on to the final slide. We are particularly interested in your feedback in terms of the reporting area, in terms of the 4 alternatives that we have identified. So that's our first question. And the second is, any of the other 3 matters that you'd like to comment on, we'd be very happy to hear that. So Jim, thank you very much for everybody listening to me. I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Lynn. Barb.
So thanks for the presentation. That was very helpful. I'm not sure I have a view on one of the alternatives for transparency, but I would encourage the team maybe to take a look. I've not followed how CAGs have evolved, but early on, maybe in the first year of reporting, when we were closely following how CAGs were being applied, we noticed some firms included what I would call very generic fraud risks as CAGs, and I could see where they might almost be misleading. For example, I saw like an investment company where misappropriation of client assets was included as a CAG. I assume that may be a fraud risk almost at every kind of company that has custody of client assets. And I could see where it could give investors a misleading view of that maybe there was some heightened risk at that one investment company when you read it, I'm not sure that there was. And so maybe as you give some additional thought to the alternatives, how would you drive useful information or information that's not so specific or not so generic, rather, that it really doesn't tell anyone anything, right? For example, if you thought someone said, well, we looked at the risk of management override of controls and we didn't find any issues. So I would just encourage you to look at that. The other thing I'll touch on is I am very supportive of how you've approached this kind of in the same flow as ISA 315. I would take a look at, so our AS 2110, I'll probably get the number wrong, but our risk assessment standard, when we did that standard, we actually took a lot of the fraud considerations and included them within our risk assessment standard. Now, I understand 315 is a little different, and you also have a lot of application material, which we don't. You would probably end up with a 500-page standard if you were to integrate fraud within it. But I will say that I think drove a very positive change in practice, because when you have the fraud standard that's separate from these kind of core audit standards, I think people think of it as a separate thing. And so we integrated it into assessment of risk to drive the mentality, right, that the auditor's responsibility is to detect material misstatements, whether due to error or fraud. And I think then that drives a lot of positive changes in audit methodology, and it keeps fraud in front of the auditor early and thinking about what could go wrong and really trying to identify fraud risks. Some of the information you're using for risk assessment would be the same information you're using for fraud risks. And so I think it's very important if you choose to integrate it in a similar way, but outside the standard. I mean, I don't think that's a bad idea, because again, I get a picture of the length once you add application material, but just something for your consideration, because I think that drove a lot of positive change when we did that.
Thanks, Barb. Klaus?
Yes, thanks. Thanks again, Len, for an excellent presentation on this important topic. Overall, I'm very supportive of the project, just to clarify that. Regarding the question raised about transparency and reporting on fraud, well, I read the background materials and I realized this has been an issue for many, many years to try to come to a solution on this. Let me address it in a slightly different way, with speaking from a preparer background and thinking about companies. I would say that any kind of alternative that you choose here in transparency will also be mirrored by developing reporting requirement also from the audit client side. So that's why I'm coming from, to reflect on what could be a proper way of reporting. And this leads me to say first that I would say that the first alternative detailed description is not really in my flavor, and neither is alternative 4, because I think that, as we discussed yesterday regarding going concern, not having it in the auditor report is not helping users of information to get to what the point is. So for me, it would be either 2 or 3, the Dutch or the UK alternatives, where that would be the main alternatives to discuss with users. Having said that, there is also another dimension, and that's coming back to the SME dimension on this. It's a general standard ISO 240, and you also have to think about scalability here to apply it to SMEs or small companies. And I'm also here concerned about this, that if you put in a requirement here to report on fraud in all kinds of audit clients, that will also drive reporting requirements for all kinds of auditing clients here. So I assume that the kind of framework to think about this kind of topic is PIEs, but you have to think about all kinds of audit clients. Thanks.
Thank you, Klaus. Hilda?
Thank you. On the transparency, overall Accounts Europe, we support transparency, but I think as far as the alternatives, we would more or less land where Klaus landed, not 1, not 4, and then the choice between 2 and 3, and maybe more 2 than 3. So that's it on that specific question. As far as any other matters, obviously, as far as, how fraud can be addressed in an audit standard, there's no silver bullet. It's like the discussion we had on going concern yesterday to a large extent, and there is always a need for a holistic approach. I think Klaas already referred to this. There is, what do the preparers do? What can the auditors do? There's very much a link, and then what is the supervision around this? So what are the different stakeholders' contributions here? And we should never forget, to keep that in mind also when we just look at audit standards. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Akihito?
Thank you, James. Thank you very much, Lynn, for the presentation. Overall, I agree with the project's current direction approach. I have 3 comments I'd like to share. First point, in considering the enhancement on communication with TCWZ and transparency in auditors reporting on fraud, a risk-based and gear-up approach, which is also used in Japanese fraud risk response audit standards, may be incorporated. This is a suggestion from the perspective that it is useful to appropriately balance. I think that it is important for strengths and weakness. The second point is regarding the balance. Excessive, too much audit procedures and documentations may undermine professional skepticism and need to be kept in mind. I believe that this is the same for developing guidance as well. Give the impact on the practices both of auditors and clients. The last point is another aspect as a response to the risk of fraud due to circular transactions, etc. Direct communication with other auditors may be useful. So my suggestion is that certain provisions related to release of confidentiality in such cases may be considered. That's all my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Akihito. See, Kazuhiro?
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Lin, for presentation. Overall, I strongly support the project proposal, and I have a brief comment in terms of transparency. I agree with the three options will be represented for the fraud description in audit report. But I'm afraid the financial statement users, such as investors and analysts, don't understand well the difference in the option presented. Option 2 is similar to CAM, so it's easy to imagine, but I'm not sure about option 1 and option 3. I think it will be easier to understand if IAASB explain how those differs from option 2. Thank you.
Thank you. Don?
Jim, could I come in there before we move on?
Yes, certainly.
In terms of the alternatives, I should have said in the presentation, and I skipped over it, unfortunately. We intend to talk to investors and put the specific examples, so the ones that we've picked out that are in the paper, to them to see what they think would be the most useful. So, because we think that people need to see the specifics of what these mean, not just the high-level descriptions. So over the next couple of months, we have every intention of engaging with investors to find out what they prefer in terms of the audit report. Because as an IAASB, we're very aware that we're looking at, between going concern, this pies with quite a few changes to the auditor's report. So whilst we want to take them each on their merits, we also have to look at the overall picture. So I just thought that might help our discussion. Jim, thank you.
Yes, I think that does. Okay, Dawn?
Thanks, Jim. I have not been sent with any specific comments on the alternative, but I do have a few other remarks nonetheless. One of the things that we wanted you to specifically consider is the scalability for smaller entities and considering the impact that it has on them. So I'm going to echo Klaus's remarks there. I also would like to echo part of what Hildy referred to. There really is no silver bullet. You know, we've been struggling with the fraud issue from time immemorial, but somehow we have to get the message out there that this just isn't an auditor responsibility, and really lay out who all the players are in the ecosystem and make it clear how, you know, what the director or those charged with governance, what are their specific responsibilities, because really for us to make any progress, we all have to be working together.
Thank you, Don. Galen?
Thank you, Jim. I'll just, well, I support what I've seen and heard from you, Lynn, and thank you for expanding on your explanation on these various alternatives. I wonder whether they should be considered as alternatives or whether there could be a blend between them. For example, 1 and 2 seems to me like one shouldn't be necessarily to the exclusion of the other. But if I were to lean towards any of these, it would have to probably be number 2. My more substantive comment, though, has to do with, you know, fraud is, as I've said on many occasions before, it's an evergreen issue. It should always be on the table. And looking at the paper, I see a paragraph talking about sustainability and ESG. And yet this seems to be focused primarily on financial and financial statement fraud, which is that's appropriate. But is there an opportunity here to maybe expand on that? I mean, that's all we're hearing about is ESG right now. And we didn't, in the prior session, we didn't hear about greenwashing, which I consider another form of fraud. So I wonder whether the group is thought about maybe picking up on that and expanding the scope, or maybe it's not in the cards. Maybe that would widen the scope too much, and ESG is moving so quickly that we can't get it into this project. But I'd be interested in your comments, Lynn.
Thanks, Galen. Paul?
Yeah, largely echoing what I've just heard. Starting with what Galen just mentioned, there may be an ESG aspect that needs to be considered. Also supportive of the remarks of Klaus and Dawn with respect to ensuring that where we land is something scalable for the SME or the less complex end of the market. In terms of the preliminary view of EFA, alternative 2 looks like where we are. So despite my being a British citizen, I think our vote at the moment might go with the Dutch approach.
All right, thank you, Paul. Natasha?
Yeah, thank you. I think Galen made a really good point there, actually, so I'll add that in to just voice my support for that. I mean, I think it is all about just detecting these sorts of, intentional misrepresentations. I guess, maybe I'm going to be a lone voice on alternative 1, but and maybe alternative 1 isn't the right answer. But what I'm very conscious of, and I note that this was one of the comments on the UK element in the longer paper, which is to avoid boilerplate. And I think, some of these kind of higher level discussions, it just become boilerplate, right? And so I think the important thing, and you can define which alternative it is that it's specific to the entity and it gives meaningful information to users so that we can then have conversations with the boards about that information. And again, just ensure that the information is therefore useful. So I think that for me is the key criteria, and therefore I don't want huge reams of detail, but I want it to be specific and not generic. I think that would be my main point. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. And Lynn, I'll just add, I think we need to really think through this in the sense that if I look at the alternatives, 2 and 3 seemed most viable to me, but I think you have to remember right now the standard is focused on material misstatement of the financial statements. And as long as that is what we're looking for, a lot of other types of fraud could fall out or would fall out because they wouldn't be material. And if you think about a large company, how significant it would have to be material to the financial statements, that doesn't happen very often. And so I think you might end up with a lot of the generic descriptions, which several people have warned against. So I do think you need to define, when you say fraud, are we still talking about what I'll call the traditional fraud in relation to the financials or something broader? And then is it in relation to being material within the financial statements, or is there some other threshold that might be relevant? But that would be my comment. And Lynn, I think that brings us to, Natasha, I see your hands up.
Sorry, I just thought, James, you made a good point. But one of the things I struggle with a little bit is the definition of materiality, because I think this was clarified actually quite helpfully by guidance that the IAASB released, at least, and talking about it being material where it impacts investment decision making. And actually, a lot of the non-financial information does impact investment decision making, and increasingly so today. You know, the more we're screening on ESG grounds, you know, we will absolutely making buy-sell decisions based on that. So it may not necessarily move the needle in a very huge way in terms of, you know, reported numbers in the financials, but certainly it's material from that perspective. And then I would go back to the fact that there are linkages between the, you know, non-financial disclosures and then the financials as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Natasha. Lynn, I guess I'll hand it back to you for any final thoughts there.
And also thanks to the staff who in the background have been saying that I didn't read the question right, and I was only meant to ask whether these were okay alternatives to put to the users of financial statements, which I accept, but it's been valuable to road test it. So thank you all very much. I shortcut it, guys. So my apologies for not dealing with the question, but we have road tested it, and it does seem that the alternatives work for people because everybody was able to articulate why they preferred a particular one and why they didn't prefer others. So I think we can tick that yes, we have got the right options there, and that road testing it with actual users of financial statements will be valuable. In terms of sustainability, ESG, outside scope, I mean, intellectually, as interesting as it would be, and how much I'd like to actually deal with that in this, it is out of scope. It is part of our assurance suite. But it is a perfect example of that crossover nexus between financial and non-financial information and the growing importance of that. Note on scalability, once we've worked out what's going to be important, we'll definitely need to consider scalability, but it's always in our heads. And I think those, and we will look at the PCAOB's risk standard. I'm pretty sure we've already read it, but we'll have another look at that. And we're also picking up bits of the Japanese standard, so appreciate that. And on materiality, yes, it is. We're not changing the base setting, which is this is material misstatement that we're talking about. So, which means it will affect the user's decision making. So with that, Jim, I'll turn back to you. I think those were the comments I wanted to pick up. But once again, many thanks for that input.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you for your time commitment. You certainly had some topics that we were able to provide some good discussion, and we appreciate your efforts with the CAG. And now we're going to go to Dave. If you could summarize any PIOB thoughts or your thoughts for today's meeting, I would appreciate that.
You bet. You bet. Thanks, Jim. And thanks to everybody for your great participation. I think this has really been a useful process, and the feedback that you've provided has been very informative. Let me just give you a few thoughts on the major projects that we talked about. First, we talked about audit evidence, and I think the principles-based approach makes sense, focusing on the inputs, the audit information, and the audit procedures being applied to that, creating the outputs, which are the audit evidence. I think that's a really important concept. Regardless of where the information comes from. So I think that's really good. I think the coordination with the other working groups like technology fraud and professional skepticism is very good. I like the stand back requirement. And when I think about that, I think about it not only in terms of a specific audit assurance, but also standing back later in the audit to look at all of the information and how does everything that you've gathered in one area of the audit potentially impact other areas of the audit. So application guidance with respect to that requirement, I think, could be useful. And this next comment, I think, is more of an audit-related comment as opposed to a public interest issue. But whenever I think about audit evidence and the important issues we talked about today, documentation is key. I think somebody raised that. But talking about the inputs, the outputs, considering corroborating and contradictory evidence, and then the auditor's conclusion is really key. On sustainability, I appreciate the urgency of that project and the speed with which you've picked that up, because that, I know, is going to be something that will take time for the IAASB and others over the next years, I'm sure, as we evolve in this area. So I just want to commend you on the extensive collaboration that you've already done and that you will continue to do. And we'll also need to collaborate, with IAASB on some of the key ethical and independence issues that could be raised in performing some of these services. So all of the collaboration that you will be doing that you've described, I think, sounds great. So I look forward to seeing the project plan with respect to that one, and realize that Tom, you and the board and Lynn have a lot of work cut out for you, but this is an area that will, I think, in the long term, be very impactful, and you'll be very proud of that. I appreciated the conversation we just had on fraud, and I just come back to a reference to, we've talked about this as an age-old issue, others have raised that. The expectation gap is real, and I think some of the things that you described, Lynn, are very important. I concur with strengthening the requirements for the auditor and aligning this with the risk identification and assessment process. It makes very good sense to me. I like what you talked about on focusing on robust communications with those charged with governance, and that is not a one-time conversation that you document, but it's an ongoing conversation throughout the process. I do think transparency will be very important, and that will probably maybe the toughest issue you have to deal with, but it'll be a very important issue, and it sounds like you've got a plan to get some very good feedback so that you can make progress in that area. And I think in any final product, it will be important to not only talk about what the conclusions of the board will be, but also express why you think this addresses at least part of the issues that are raised by the expectation gap. So Jim, that's it.
Thank you, Dave. I appreciate your comments, and this will conclude this section. What we will do next is we'll go into a closed session, which I will believe would be the CAG members and staff. So I will turn it over to Phil or Michelle. Is there anything you need to do on your side, or can we just proceed?
Nothing else, unless there's any comments from the chair of the IAASB or to technical director. We can close.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. Tom, do you have any comments or thoughts?
Other than that, you having these sessions right before our board meeting has been tremendously helpful to us, and gives us a lot of good background and input to consider next week. So we're much better for it. And so I just reiterate, thank you for your service. And I hope to get to see everyone at some point in person soon.
Thank you. And with that, I think we will go into the closed session.